hell yes. Why didn't I sit here before? This is really comfy. I'm not sitting on a dog bed, you're sitting on a dog bed. Yes, okay. Before we begin, I feel it's only fair to acknowledge my new friend. His name is Alfred. He enjoys flavoured teas and long walks in the park. Please make him feel at home. Hi guys, it's Leanne and welcome back to episode 2 of Totally Mental, my series where I talk about everything involving mental health that is bookish. In our last episode, which I will link up here for you, we talked about gentle mental health books. Easy ways to ease yourself into the subject, to ease your loved ones into the subject, and just to find some kind of solace when you're having a hard time. So if you're looking for any books that fit that description, you can check that out. In today's episode, I've decided that I'm just going to bite the bullet and we're going to talk about my most triggery issue. I'm doing this partly because I feel like it will help me to say things out loud, but also partially because this is one of those topics that I feel like we collectively still are really pants at dealing with. We don't bring this topic up in casual conversation in the way that we might say anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorders. We just don't talk about it because it's terrifying. Today's episode, in short, is about grief and grieving, specifically the loss of a loved one, because I want to make it very clear here that when we talk about grief and grieving, there are many types of grief out there. There are many losses of opportunities in our life and massive changes out with our control that also fall into the idea of the grieving process. So just over 7 years ago now, I lost my granddad. My granddad and I were so incredibly close. He was the heights of old school charm. He was a gentleman, a consummate kind person who would do anything for anyone and who really taught me about the concept of hard work and respect. And I can never, ever pay him back for the experiences that he gave me as a child that helped to form me as an adult. So I'm going to talk about a handful of different kinds of books today which deal with grief in really different and really complex ways. And all of them, I can honestly say, in my life have changed how I feel about grief, how I think about grief, and have made me more open and more willing to talk about the experience and demystify it. So the first 2 books that I have to talk to you about are kind of roughly linked. They are The Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights by Joan Didion. These are both memoirs about 2 separate experiences which Joan Didion unfortunately had incredibly close together in her life, and how those 2 major losses which left her very much alone as a family unit, it was very much just her left, how those experiences changed her outlook on her every day. I've talked a little bit about these 2 before, particularly Blue Nights, which is my absolute favourite of them, but I feel like they're so underrepresented. I feel like we do not talk about them enough. In The Year of Magical Thinking, Joan literally drops us in at the moment where her husband has a massive heart attack at their kitchen table in New York, completely out of the blue, collapses and dies in front of her. This loss sends shockwaves through Joan's life and she can't process her grief. She leaves his shoes by the front door because she's like, well, I can get rid of all of these other things, but he needs shoes. He'll need shoes when he comes back. This is genuinely one of the most arresting and confronting books about grief that I have ever read, and I do not recommend it lightly. If you feel like you're at the point in your journey where you're really raw and you want some comfort and you want to be given a helping hand along the process, I would not necessarily suggest this book. However, if you are at the stage in grief where you feel angry and resentful, and you don't understand why this is your experience, and you don't really know how to move beyond those feelings, or whether you want to, which is also definitely a thing, then I suggest this one. Next up in Blue Nights, Joan talks about losing her daughter Quintana, who she sadly lost to an incurable illness quite suddenly after the publication of The Year of Magical Thinking. So Joan went from being a widower to being completely bereaved. And with this book, she touches on the feelings of helplessness that you have in the wake of grief, because you cannot change those experiences that you have had. You cannot turn back time and have made yourself a better person. And in this book, she talks about this really complex and complicated relationship that she had with Quintana after adopting her. That actually helped me a lot. I'm adopted myself, and I know that my relationship with adoption is kind of up and down. Although I had a perfectly safe adoption, it was not always the happiest adoption. And so it was nice to see the point of view of a mother who felt like she hadn't done well by her child. She'd given her everything, literally. She had given her safety and money and, you know, clothes and all those things, but she didn't necessarily believe that she had given her affection. And so this is very much a book about the ability to look at grief straight in the face and look back on your previous experiences and make peace with them, and accept that just because you had a complicated history with somebody before they died, it does not mean that you didn't care. It doesn't invalidate the feeling of grief that you have. So those are two books that deal with the passing of a spouse and then the passing of a child, but what about the passing of a parent? So the next book that I have here is one that is quite famous now because it did have a major motion picture adapted from it. This is Wild by Cheryl Strayed, and you guys all know that I am nuts about Cheryl Strayed. I love her to tiny little pieces. Her advice column collection essay series book, Dear Sugar, where she wrote anonymously as an advice columnist, Sugar, and she answered people's emails on an internet column and is now collected into this book, also talks massively about grief, and very much about all different kinds of grief, not just from the passing of a person. But Wild is very much the thing that came before Dear Sugar. Wild is the raw and honest response to grief that Cheryl Strayed had. Wild is the falling apart. So Cheryl Strayed's mother, who again she had an incredibly complicated relationship with throughout her life, passed away, and her reaction to this, after a lot of numbness and indecision about her life, was to go solo hiking along the Pacific Crest Trail, which is an amusing series of events in and of itself. But it's less the experience of choosing the wrong books and of spur of the moment buying a tent that you then discover is really beyond your skill set, of meeting random people on the road and forming connections with them that you then feel have been broken and you're resentful about losing those people as well. It's less about all of those things, and to me Wild is more about flashbacks, because Cheryl Strayed is experiencing very, very vivid, very detailed flashbacks in the form of intrusive thoughts, and they are, when it comes to grief, usually a form of PTSD. They force her to go and do something else which is spur of the moment and ill-conceived and not thought through. They force her to occupy herself immediately with something, and occasionally that something was the sexual company of other people, occasionally that thing was alcohol, occasionally it was being unsafe and not reporting her whereabouts or her well-being to people who were concerned about her. It was very, very much a process of filling up her time so that she didn't have time to feel sad. Now, one of the other things that we deal with when we go through the death of a loved one who is a parent or a guardian, or in my case my granddad, the person who brought me up, is that we are suddenly very, very aware of our own mortality. And that is really the core discussion, and this really isn't about you. Jean Hannah Edelstein's look back on her father's death and facing her own mortality. So Jean made the choice to move back to the States in 2014 after she discovered that her father was dying from cancer. And 6 weeks after she moved back to the States, her father unfortunately passed away. In the wake of him passing away, going through all of the usual ebbs and flows that we have during grief, she was then told that it's very possible that she may carry the same gene that her father had that caused his very sudden cancer and his very sudden death. As with most of us, until we have this first big significant loss in our life, Jean had never really faced her own mortality. And so suddenly having this fact thrust in her face, this will you be tested, will you be not tested, what happens if you do have the gene, and how do you, I think one of the lines that I loved about the back was, how do you motivate yourself to go on an OkCupid date when you're struggling with your own mortality? When it comes to confronting your own mortality, there is nothing more catastrophic than being diagnosed with a life-changing or life-limiting disease and having to consciously, as a full-fledged person still with all of their faculties and all of their concerns and their everyday, you know, what am I going to have for dinner tomorrow, and also now I need to plan a funeral. That is a grief in and of itself. I have a friend. They can tell when we're sad. Can't you? You can tell when we're sad. Yes, you can. We never know what is around the corner, and so one of the books that I found really, really compelling when I was thinking about grief and trying to work out how I was going to put one foot in front of the other was Shaking Hands with Death by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett was diagnosed in his 50s with Alzheimer's and of course has now sadly passed away. And during the course of being diagnosed and realising what this would mean for him, he explored the idea of what it is to live and what it is to live with a diagnosis that is going to change everything and possibly end everything, and what you do with that information. He was a massive advocate of the right to die, which unfortunately we do not have at the moment in the UK, and this really tiny little book really delves so deep into the idea of owning our own mortality and the idea of looking at, you know, dead in the eye and seeing it as the next big adventure, as he so famously says. And that was comforting for me. It was truly comforting. Now, when it comes to unsung books about grief, I really feel like there are certain books that fall through the cracks. Because we as a society shield ourselves so much from the idea of death and cling so much to the idea that we will be immortalised in some way by something that we do that brings some other people joy or value, we have removed ourselves so many steps from the process of coming to terms with a death and moving through it. And so an unsung hero in this category is When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin Doughty, of course, runs the YouTube channel Ask a Mortician. She is wonderful and so funny. Again, if you enjoy my sense of humour but with a really decent sticky dollop of morbidity in there, then Caitlin is your girl. But When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is not morbid at all. In fact, it is completely joyous. Caitlin was floundering and had no idea what she wanted to do for a living or what kind of industry she wanted to end up in, and she stumbled into funeral care and funeral directing and the life of a mortician and embalmer. This one just, it it's head and shoulders above all the rest. The last memoir that I'm going to mention here is another book that I do not see anybody talk about nearly enough, and it's one that I am absolutely obsessed with. In fact, I think I'm probably going to reread it after I finish this video because it's now just in the back of my mind. This is Everything is Teeth by Evie Wyld, and it's illustrated by Joe Sumner. The illustration in this is basically a portrait of grief. It is all of the intensely muted colours that we feel when our landscape has been dulled by that experience. Save for a few very obvious splashes of a certain colour, this entire graphic novel is this palette, and it so very much spoke to the way that I felt for a long time after my granddad passed away, that I just can't quite reach for emotions, I can't quite grab them. I see what I should feel and I see them on my horizon, but I just can't quite feel them or embody them, and that is very much this entire graphic novel. Evie Wyld is an amazing novelist and I so enjoy her works of fiction, but this one is a memoir of her childhood in Australia, growing up between Australia and the UK, and all of the anxieties that you have as a young person dealing with death and grief and the reality that you will lose people and people will change. I would love to say it's a quicker read than the others, but I don't think it was because I pored over these pages, but it's so worth it. Now, while I think it's really important that we consume non-fiction and memoir and we actually listen to other people's human experiences and engage with that, I think that it's also really important that we find a way to engage with the idea of grief through fiction. So, a couple of books that come to mind straight away when I think about grief are really close to my heart. The first one of those is Eve Green by Susan Fletcher. I have said a couple of times on this channel, to some degree of controversy, that if I had to pick, if I absolutely was forced with like torture devices to choose a favourite book, it would be Eve Green. This is a book that means so incredibly much to me. Eve Green opens with a very young Eve. She is a kid in Manchester who's pretty streetwise even at a very young age, and her whole life is contained in her little cosy flat with her single mother, and she feels like she knows her life and she has an equal footing on everything. And then her mother very unexpectedly dies, and the only people that Eve has at all are grandparents in the wild depths of Wales. And so she is not only dealing with the grief of her parent at a very young age, but she is ripped out of her entire life and forced into another situation that she is not ready for, is not prepared for, does not want. And so it deals with the grief of loss and how it can potentially impact everything else, because we don't often talk about that. People die and we're sorry about it and we're sad for the person, but we don't always remember that that means that that person might lose their home, might lose their job, might, you know, there are so many other implications that go along with grief that we don't talk about, and Eve Green very much touches on that. The next fictional book that I have about grief is actually a YA novel. I would say that this one, more than any other YA novel I have ever read, is truly for all ages and all experiences. It is just such a universally present and now thing to have to deal with that I think everybody should read it, and that is The Piper's Son by Melina Marchetta. So The Piper's Son is technically the follow-up to Saving Francesca by Melina Marchetta, which deals very deeply with depression and anxiety, debilitating, horrendous depression which radiates out from Francesca's mother to everybody else in her life. And The Piper's Son is technically the follow-up to that. It's a companion novel, but it can be read entirely on its own if Saving Francesca doesn't appeal to you. This one is about Tom, and he is now, I think he's college age at the beginning of this one, whereas he was a teenager in Saving Francesca, and he thought that he had his life all clued in, and then all of a sudden, overseas, he's in Australia, overseas, his uncle is literally blown to pieces when minding his own business and walking to work one morning in a terrorist attack. And Tom is then left with that numb feeling of unreality that I think that grief leaves you with. And I think this novel, more than anything else that I've recommended here, really touches on that feeling of unreality, where nothing fundamentally has changed around you because this person was so many miles away, but it's changed your entire family, it's changed your everyday, but there's nothing tangible to show for it, and nobody outside of your family or outside of your four walls understands what has just happened. So those are all of my recommendations for books about grief. It's a very difficult topic, it's a very hard hitting topic. I feel as if there's no real way to approach it that won't hurt, and I feel like that's one of those things that we need to accept, is that when it comes to the subject of grief, there is no way to avoid it, there's no way to get around it. It has to be processed, it demands to be felt, and we can't sort of put one foot in front of the other until we have in some way pieced together the events and made some sort of sense or felt some sort of lesson as a result of them, because that's what we do as humans. We are storytellers, and that's how we process grief and death and life. That's how we link everything together and give it some meaning. So as always with any of my mental health any of my videos, but specifically any of my mental health videos, please feel free to leave your experience in the comments. Again, it is an entirely safe place. Also, as always, if you have read any of the books that I've mentioned here today, please let me know what you thought about them, good or bad, with the exception of Eve Green, because I'm not be your friend anymore. Please also let me know in the comment section if there is a mental health topic that you guys would like me to touch on. I have several more lined up, but I am always happy for feedback because you guys have the best ideas. I'm now going to pet this cat before she knocks over all of my stacks of books and my tripod, and I will speak to you guys later. Bye! Honestly, if you're gonna slink around, come and have the common decency to be cute on camera and actually like inspire kisses. Oh, kisses. Inspire people with views. This is Miss Marple. Yes, she is named after that Miss Marple, and she is nothing like her. Very stabby. You appear to be stuck. I mean, just rude. Rude. Rude.